Welcome to the party. You found the Mouse Castle Lounge, the place to be for good times and great conversations from the world of Disney. The bar is open, your table is waiting, and drinks are now being served. Come on in. And now, here's your host, the keeper of the Mouse Castle Lounge, Tim Calloway.
Welcome to the lounge. It's June 25th, 2015, and I'm Tim Calloway. We've got a great show for you today. We're going to talk about the legacy of Disney legend Van France with Doug Lipp, author of the book Disney U. But first, there's much to learn if you follow the Mouse Castle. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/The Mouse Castle. On Twitter, I am Disney Tim. The Mouse Castle is also on Tumblr, Pinterest, and Instagram. You can reach us by email at podcast@themousecastle.com. Call our listener line at 702-475-5MCL. That's 702-475-5625. And you can visit the blog at themousecastle.com. And while you're there, download the free Mouse Castle app for your mobile device. Just click the pic that says, "Get the app." The summer 1967 issue of Disney News magazine contained an article entitled, "University of Disneyland, an Institute of Smiles." The story told of the park's in-house training of more than 5,000 cast members each year. Cast members who were taught to welcome each guest with a smile that's sincere and ensure every new employee became a people specialist before he or she actually set foot on the job. This progressive, people-centric approach to training was the brainchild of Van Arsdale France, who joined Disney in March 1955, just months before Disneyland's grand opening. With the support and encouragement of Walt Disney, Van France created the University of Disneyland, which would soon become the gold standard of employee training programs. Over the decades, the program would evolve into what is now called Disney University, and to this day, it takes its cues from the principles and standards France developed 60 years ago. Doug Lipp was hired by Disney in the late 1970s and would later work with and be mentored by Van France. Fluent in Japanese, Doug was part of the startup team at Tokyo Disneyland in preparation of the resort's grand opening in 1983. Since leaving Disney, Doug has gone on to become a renowned speaker and training consultant with Fortune 100 companies. He's written 8 books, including his most recent, Disney U, How Disney University Develops the World's Most Engaged, Loyal, and Customer-Centric Employees. He has a lot of stories to tell about Walt Disney, about Van France, and about the guest experience at Disney parks worldwide. Doug Lipp is my guest today in the Mouse Castle Lounge. In the lounge with me right now is Doug Lipp. Doug, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Tim. Thanks for having me.
Well, a pleasure to have you. I was poking around your website at douglipp.com, and that's Lipp with 2 P's. And you do a lot of corporate training and organizational development and a lot of consulting with different companies. But among all of the video clips and photos and everything like that, there's a lot of pictures of you and your wife, Pam, as cast members at Disneyland. And you had the full gear with the gondolier outfit with It's a Small World. And I think I spotted a pic of you with in custodian gear and all that. How did you end up working at Disneyland, and how did that lead to hooking up with Van France and Disney University?
Well, Tim, I was actually an intern before the intern program ever began. So how does that work?
Okay.
I was an undergrad at Long Beach State, Cal State University, Long Beach. And my ultimate goal actually was to be a director of a YMCA. I wanted to lead international exchange programs with high school students. And part of my degree was to do an internship at a for-profit and a not-for-profit organization, so a semester each. And my professor knew somebody at the Disney University, and they introduced me to each other. And lo and behold, I was actually spent a semester working through what's now defunct, but it was called the Magic Kingdom Club, which was kind of a marketing department for companies to enable them to get discount tickets and all that sort of thing. But
I was a club director with the Magic Kingdom Club at different employers for many years.
Okay, so at Magic Kingdom Club, one of the benefits to small employers was an opportunity to learn from folks within the Disney University, orientation programs, employee development programs. So with my interest in college with employee development, I helped create and then present a series of programs to these small mom and pop sized organizations that were members of MKC.
And what year would this have been? When were you doing
I was
this?
a senior in college in 1978, and at the time, my minor was Japanese language. I speak Japanese fluently. I started studying in high school, and I was getting ready to go to grad school in Japan, so I was going to be off the map for 2 years. And I knew that Disney at the time was negotiating with Oriental Land Company. They were considering moving into Japan. It looked like it was going to move forward, but we didn't know. And about midway through my 2-year college graduate program in Japan, I got a letter saying, "Hey, Disney has just signed with OLC, Oriental Land Company." And so my last year while I was in Japan, I made contact with folks at MKC and Disney Studios and Disneyland. And ultimately, when I came back from Japan in '80, I was picked up by Disney, the Tokyo Planning Center, which was the team that Jim Cora led to get Tokyo Disneyland started. And actually, my first job to him was as a Japanese interpreter. They said, "Hey, everybody at Disneyland starts on the front line, so you can either be a ride operator or we've got this really cool project in Japan, and we're bringing all these executives over to learn about the Disney way. Would you like to train them and be an interpreter at the same time?" I said, "Count me in." So,
That's kind of a no-brainer.
yeah, so I spent about 6 months as the only non-Asian interpreter of about 12 and trainers, and then I was picked up. Jim Cora, again, one of my great mentors at Disneyland, suggested that I apply for, and I was ultimately picked for, the internal Disney intern program, which doesn't really exist anymore either, but it was for existing cast members to move into leadership positions. And it was a heavily competitive, highly contested position, and there were about 20 of us, and I got to be one of the HR people, and that was really the beginning of moving into the Disney University, meeting Van France, and all the movers and shakers in the Disney University.
When did you first meet Van France?
Well, it would have been when I started in the company in late 80, early 81.
And was it as part of training, or was it when you were actually working in that department?
It would have been when he came through the Tokyo Planning Center. Jim Cora used Van extensively to help convey the Disney way to the Japanese, and he actually had Van write The Spirit of Disneyland, and it's a softbound book that contains a lot of the same content that many of your fans will have read in Window on Main Street. But Van was a constant presence, and it really came to me what role he played when I was picked up by the Disney intern program, the leadership intern program for management, when he kicked off the very first session. And that's really how I began my book, Disney U, was that first evening, and we all listened with rapt attention to Van talking about his interactions with Walt and the challenges of starting Disneyland and no one really knowing what a theme park was. And he was this genteel elder statesman, and then we started asking him questions about, well, what would Walt think, and what do you think Walt would think about that? And pretty soon he turned into this whirling dervish of profanity and energy, saying, in very nice terms today, well, what do you bozos think? Aren't you the future leaders of this company? Why are you asking me? Well, you tell me, what do you think the future is? So it was a real interesting flip from elder statesman to putting our feet to the flames, which I learned was really Van's style. He didn't back down to anybody, but he kept you honest, and he had a heart of gold.
What were some of his philosophies as far as training cast members?
Well, there's something that I remember that so many men and women that I interviewed for my book, and again, I didn't write Disney U until 3 years ago, and this is well after I left the company, but I went back and I interviewed a number of men and women who were my colleagues or my bosses or my boss's bosses, or even Ron Miller, who had been the CEO, and even Michael Eisner, who had been the CEO. And to the person who knew Van, they said one of two things, Tim. Van had the ability to make the inherently complex simple. So he took the Disney theme park experience for new cast members, and he took this massively complex environment and made it easy to understand. And in fact, I use a metaphor that I think really clarifies it. He took this giant pot of minestrone soup with vegetables and meat and all kinds of stuff floating around, which is the complexity of running a theme park. And by virtue of the Disney University and the training programs, condensed it into a bouillon cube that every cast member could understand. And between him and Jim Cora and Dick Nunes and the other founding members of the university, they did a tremendous job of making the operations understandable. And then the other thing that Van was known for is he would not take excuses, much like Walt Disney. In fact, there's a great quote of Van's that is essentially, budgets might be tight, but creativity is always free. And I use that quote with executives around the world in some of the major companies around the world today and say, yes, of course we can all be victims and we can all complain about budgets and headcount. But you know what? Walt Disney and Van France always said those are always going to be in place. Those challenges and constraints are always going to be there. Creativity is always free. Why not focus on that as well?
What were some of the stories he told about working with Walt? What was his relationship with Walt?
It was an interesting relationship. He was actually hired by another gentleman who brought him to the Disney Studios to meet Walt, a guy named C.V. Wood. But his relationship was kind of an arm's length with Walt. He knew Walt. They knew each other. And Walt basically entrusted Van to help create this happiest place on earth. And I think that it speaks volumes to Walt's leadership style that he knew when to delegate and he held people accountable. So Walt and his team of Imagineers were busy creating the infrastructure and the buildings and the attractions at Disneyland, and he basically turned over to Van the job of being the human architect. You know, they were the architects of things, and Van was the architect of people. And he and Dick Nunes turned this program called the Orientation Program, which ultimately evolved 7 years later into the Disney University. So they created a dynasty from nothing. And what Van learned in his due diligence in working with Walt and in going through the studio back in the late 54 time frame, early 1955, he realized that Walt and he shared a similar sense of humor. And they both Van realized that Walt was a huge proponent of edutainment, which everybody knows about now, but back then nobody knew about. And one of my favorite quotes from Walt Disney is, "Laughter is no enemy to learning." And Van took that. If you look at some of the earlier training manuals that Van had created back in the 40s and the 30s, well before he met Walt, there are some dramatic similarities to him in his style of using cartoons and visuals to convey a learning point, much like Walt Disney would have used. And I think the turning point for Van was seeing a 1940s era policy and procedure manual from the Disney studio called The Ropes at Disney's. And he realized then that even with things like working hours and sick time and all the boring policies and procedure stuff, it can be conveyed in a fun and memorable way, because he had done the same thing using cartoon characters and funny ideas to still basically say, you got to get to work on time. If you don't get to work on time, you're done. But he did it in a way that people could relate to it.
I've seen that particular manual, the Ropes. As a matter of fact, I think the Walt Disney Fandom Museum actually posted it on their website or their blog, like on Labor Day a few years ago, and exactly what you said. It's a manual that has lots of illustrations, lots of cartoony drawings of employees of the Walt Disney Studios, and very much in tune with the times. A bit sexist.
Oh, massively
to
sexist,
say the least.
And as were many of Van's things. But the whole idea was, they still said that you can either go down the boring route to convey information or the engaging route. And at the time, it was perfectly appropriate. So that just meant so much to Van to know that his style would be appreciated, and that's when he bought into the whole approach.
Mm-hmm. And when developing the Disney University program, what were some of just the basic principles or expectations, I guess, that he had for new cast members joining the company?
Well, I have to go back to some of the comments that Jim Cora made to me when I interviewed him for the book. Again, Jim was one of my mentors at Disneyland. He tapped me to come over to Tokyo Disneyland to help start the operations side of that as a very young cast member. I was in my late 20s when I went over there, 27 years of age, and I got to help start the Disney University. And Jim was one of the founding members of Disney University. Van and he and 3 other people worked on this. And one of the things that Van was determined to do was to make the Disney University relevant. He did not want it to be a standalone ivory tower experience. He wanted every instructor to know about operations. Thus, he picked young operators like Jim Cora who knew how to run the park, and he said, you know, you folks might not have a lot of training experience, but I can train you to be trainers. What you bring to the table is credibility with the operators, and something that Van had realized since the park had begun in 1955, and then Van left for a couple of years to do some private consulting. But when he returned at Dick Nunes's request, Van found some disconnects between the university staff, or back then the training staff, and the frontline cast members. And therefore, he made sure he had a team of trainers that spent a lot of time in the park. And Jim Cora, in his own words, said, I spent hours going out in the park, and I interviewed and I worked with cast members. I did the job. And maybe he trained 16 hours of the week in the university. The rest of the time, he was doing the real work like everybody else. So that instantly bridged the gap of credibility that you see worldwide in so many training organizations. The training staff puts together what they think is great. They send all these people through their version of whatever the university is, and then as soon as those frontline employees go out to the real job in the factory or whatever it is, somebody says, well, I don't care what you just learned the last 4 days back there in so-and-so's training program, but I'm going to teach you the ropes today. And so he demanded, meaning Van demanded, that there be credibility, and he built that into the program. Mm-hmm. To get to your question about what he expected of cast members, that really wasn't Van's call as far as who was hired, but I think the idea was that if you really had a passion for the job, you would get it done.
And that's kind of consistent with the principle that that you mention a lot in the training and the public speaking that you do. You make a point of discussing Walt Disney's ability to walk the walk, as you put it.
Yeah.
Elaborate on that a little bit as far as what walking the talk or walking the walk really means.
Well, it's really in Disney speak, it's walk the park. And again, I learned this from one of my interviews doing when I was writing Disney U. And again, I interviewed a guy who had been an hourly cast member in the 60s, early 60s, when Walt Disney was still vibrant and walking the park and engaged. He was until the day that he passed. But the idea is that Walt was always in the park, whether it's interacting with cast members or with guests, day shift, night shift. And the idea is that no one is too big to visit the front lines. No one is too busy to visit the front lines and to interact with employees and customers. And walking the park meant that Walt, this guy shared a story, and I write about it in the book. He said, we were all cast members on Jungle Cruise, and Walt got upset with us because we weren't smiling and engaged. And when the hippos jumped out of the water, we acted bored because we'd seen the hippos 5,000 times that summer already. And Walt challenged us. He said, you folks have to plus the show. If you don't plus this show, we're going to lose these guests, and it's going to take years to get them back. You've got 1 week to practice looking surprised. And this guy said you can only imagine the energy we put in the next week to looking surprised. And at first it felt kind of strange, but then it became second nature. And by the end of the week, we actually had more energy at the end of the week than the beginning, because guests would engage with us as the more we engage with them. But this all began because Walt walked the park, literally got in the Jungle Cruise boats, saw how the skippers were interacting, and implored them to do more. And I challenge leaders around the world in my private consulting work. You know what? If the founder of the company could get out and talk to people, you can too. But all too often I see these executives that are hiding behind budgets and reports and spreadsheets and important meetings, and they come up with all these random excuses why they shouldn't walk the park, whatever the park equivalent is in their business.
And when you have the big boss himself giving you direction on how you do your job, you tend to want to do your job.
Exactly. And even when I talked with Ron Miller, and again, I had visited his office on a number of occasions when I was at the studio after I left Disneyland to go to Japan. Then from Japan, I was transferred to Disney Studio headquarters, and I knew Ron Miller at that time as well. But when I recently, meaning 3 years ago, reconnected with him to write the book, I said, well, what is the true story behind Walt and his connectivity with people? He said he really cared about people. And Ron himself talked about how many times he and Diane, of course, his wife, and Walt's daughter and their kids would stay in the apartment with Walt above the fire station. And Ron recounted how many times he would see Walt pacing around up there, not content to stay put, and he'd go down the stairs and start interacting with the janitors on the graveyard shift, always asking other people, what could we do to improve this place? And that's just another example of walking the park and then gathering enough information to continually plus the show.
You talk about leadership a lot in your presentations, and how the right balance of leadership makes for a successful company. And, to use an example, Walt was the creative risk taker, but Roy Disney was the more conservative, pragmatic type. And you've talked about a similar relationship between Michael Eisner and Frank Wells. Does Bob Iger have that with Tom Staggs now, his current COO?
I don't know Tom, and I don't know Bob directly. I would say that most organizations don't have the one-to-one balance. It's rather unique to have that polar opposite in one person. Generally, it's a cadre of people. And I'm actually more of a proponent of having a cadre of people, because if you have that polar opposite, let's say that you're a Steve Jobs, and a Steve Jobs is like a Walt Disney who can pretty much do anything. They can dream, they can do, they can challenge, they can make it come to life. But how do you replace the equivalent? And so when you've got the Walt Disney, Roy Disney, or the Frank Wells and the Michael Eisner balancing act, the challenge that most organizations have is, whether it's found in two people or a team of people who are contrarian thinkers, how deep is your bench? Who's filling the role when these people are gone? Who's being trained and prepared right now to fill the shoes? And certainly with organizational politics, generally when one person is promoted, somebody else who had been vying for that same job usually leaves the company when they're really top people. So that leaves a further void that you've got to fill. So whether Staggs and Iger have that relationship, I couldn't answer, but I would hope that they at least have the ability to be brutally honest with each other. And that's what Van France, getting back to Van, what he brought to the table was brutal honesty with every level of the organization. I mean, he was honest with people like me, many layers below him and many years younger, with his colleagues, and also with Walt Disney. In fact, in my book, I have an excerpt from a memo that Walt sent to the Park Operating Committee, which would have been Dick Nunis and a bunch of other executives. Walt Disney would have seen this. He was actively involved in park operations. And one of the things that Van realized when he came back in the early 60s again was kind of the disconnect between leadership and front lines at Disneyland. He wrote, he said, the trouble with people is we get hardening of the mental arteries, we get cirrhosis of the enthusiasm, and we get arthritis of the imagination. Well, Tim, can you think of anybody who has ever put together a set of words like that? I mean, most people say, well, we're having a little bit of disconnect, we're having motivational problems, or our net promoter scores are down. But Van knew that in order for him to catch the eyes and ears of the Park Operating Committee and ideally Walt, he had to use a creative set of words, but he was also not going to mince words. We're in trouble, we got to do something about it. And every organization needs that. I always ask, teams of whether it's 2 or 20,000 people that I work with, who is the equivalent of Van France in your organization? If you have him or her, celebrate it. If you don't, you got a lot of work to do.
And don't be afraid to be blunt. And that doesn't mean be disrespectful, but it means speaking your mind.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm going to guess that Walt Disney appreciated having someone like Van France, because he wasn't a huge fan of yes men.
No. I mean, Walt. I mean, he had the men and women that I know. I never met Walt. He passed away well before I started the company. He passed away in 1966, as everyone knows, and I was 11 years old at the time. So they weren't hiring people to run the park as 11-year-olds. But Jim Cora and Marty Sklar and all these folks that I know and worked with, and that also added so many great stories to my book, are the ones that would say, yeah, he was brutally honest as well. And sometimes he'd catch us in a moment of weakness, and Walt would say, well, is that your best shot? And you might say yes. And then Walt would light up and say, the best is never the best. So you're always on guard, realizing, boy, this person is going to push me to the next level, whether I want to get there or not.
Mm-hmm. Do you still consult with Disney?
Not with Disneyland or the company. I am doing volunteer work with the Disney Family Museum. I was asked a couple of years ago to give a presentation with Jim Cora, and again, he is the main reason my book Disney U got done. I had this idea about Van. I knew Jim knew Van for years, much longer than most people in the company. And I approached Jim and I told him my proposal for writing this book, and he said, I'm with you. If you want some help, let me know. And pretty soon I was asking Jim to maybe give me an idea of who I should talk to next. And pretty soon I'd want to talk to somebody and I'd say, well, Jim Cora gave me your name, and oh, Jim, okay, great. Well, if he's on board, I am. And that never hurt to have a man with his credibility backing the project. But Jim was asked, as I, to come into the Disney Family Museum and give a presentation. And they have, as you know, their monthly calendar of events. And they really had never done a presentation about the business side of the company. It's always about the animation, which is wonderful, and the films and the creative side. And this was a departure for them to realize that, wow, by Walt hiring Van and to enable Van to run with his creativity in developing the Disney University, de facto, it's what helped create the happiest place on earth. So Jim and I gave a presentation about Van and the Disney University, and how actually Jim had been asked by Walt to go help Van out. As a result of that, Tim, my wife and I, Pam, have the last 2.5 years worked extensively with the Walt Disney Family Museum to help them branch out to corporate sponsors or people that want training. And we all know about the wonderful programs that Disney Institute puts together, but there are some organizations that don't have the budget for that or just don't want to leave the area, so they go to Disney Family Museum and they say, wow, look at all these beautiful displays and look at all these pictures. What's the story behind that? And quite frankly, to make a long story short, we're helping the museum kind of bring to life the learning opportunities that are found in each of the galleries at the museum. And what do some of these things mean regarding creativity and persistence and failure and success that every one of us can still learn from vis-a-vis Walt's approach to business and life?
Yeah, I mean, everything in the museum, aside from what you see right in front of you, every single item has a story behind it. Sometimes many stories.
Exactly.
Along that line, what's your favorite Van France story?
It's got to be a story that Daryl Metzger, who was my manager in Japan, he was the head of the HR team in Japan, and he'd been the manager of the Disney University in California. And Daryl's a good friend as well, and he recounted a story that I guess it'd be a combination, Tim, of it's two things actually. Let me tell you a Daryl Metzger and a Jim Cora story. Daryl told me of a time that Van came in and said, we got to change traditions around. This vaunted traditions program that Van started at the request of Roy when Walt passed away. And Van challenged Daryl. He said, when do we take our cast members to human resources to get their costumes and to understand all this stuff about their jobs? And Daryl said, well, after they're done with traditions. And Van said, yeah. And all the time that we have them for the day in traditions, they're thinking about, how am I going to look in my costume and what's it going to be like where I work? He said, why don't we reverse the program? Van challenged Daryl. He said, why don't we take them to costuming and HR first and let them get that stuff out of their mind, and then the rest of the time they're in traditions, we've got them. They're with us because they're not daydreaming about their costume. And Daryl said the reason he was able to do that is because he was constantly in touch with cast members as well. He walked the park like Walt, which gets to my Jim Cora story. Jim told me, he said, Van would walk the park all the time with a camera in his hand. He'd engage cast members. He'd engage guests. Hey, how you doing in the park today? Can I take your picture? He'd go backstage and talk with people cleaning pots, scrubbing floors. And he would snap their picture, ask a couple questions, engage, laugh. Then he'd go back to his office at Circle B Ranch and start typing up some of the comments that he heard. And then Jim laughed. He said, you know, Doug, 9 times out of 10, Van didn't have any film in his camera. He used it simply as a prop, as a bridge to connect with people and have them open up. So, I mean, that ability to walk the park, just like Walt Disney did. And so there's a quote that I have in Disney that I think sums up both the Daryl Metzger changing the traditions ordering story and the Jim Cora story of Van didn't have film in his camera. And Van talks about facts are easy to identify. I was always looking for feelings that were bothering cast members. And again, he learned that from Walt, because Walt would walk the park. Yes, of course, Walt looked at numbers, and he was certainly a good businessman, but he also realized that the way you really connect with people is face-to-face, and that's exactly what Ron Miller told me when he said Walt really cared about people. Hence, he'd walk out of his apartment at night and talk to people.
All right. Well, Doug, your book is Disney U. It's been out for a little while, but you can still find it on Amazon. And it's full of all sorts of stories like this about the development of the University of Disneyland and later Disney University. And, of course, if people want to find out more about you, they can always go to DougLip.com and see all the great training and organizational development you do as well.
Well, thanks, Tim. It's been a pleasure, and thanks for all the work you do with the Mouse Castle and all the information you share. It's a real pleasure and honor to be able to chat with you and just be a small part of the work that you do.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you spending time with me today in the Mouse Castle Lounge.
All righty.
And that will do it for this edition of the Mouse Castle Lounge. Thank you to Doug Lip for being my guest. Don't miss a single episode of the Mouse Castle Lounge. Subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or SoundCloud. And you can also download the free Mouse Castle app, which you can get right now by going to themousecastle.com and clicking Get the App. Anthony Reynolds and I host Inside the Mouse Castle with your weekly dose of Disney news, information, and commentary. Give us a listen this Monday. The Mouse Castle and the Mouse Castle Lounge are not affiliated with the Walt Disney Company. I just like to talk about them. I'm Tim Calloway. It's been a blast as always, so let's do this again real soon. Take care.